Hello and welcome to the next section in our Joining the Dots and Managing Your Mantras. So I'm Graham Wales and we'll catch up where we were the previous episode. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about relationship triangles. So the traditional triangle model that covers all industries, developed from the middle of the 20th century and commonly used in scorecards and workplaces today. So the basic premise of this is that there's a statistical relationship between the larger numbers of low consequence events and the diminishing number of high consequence events. So if I had an example from my own life, I guess I've handled abrasive materials and products probably millions of times. Scratched myself with very minor abrasions tens of thousands of times. Scratches that have made me wince a bit and left a mark thousands of times, perhaps cut myself hundreds of times, and cut myself requiring more medical intervention relatively few times. So these triangles are intuitive and work with our natural daily exposure of life. And that's one of the things that's good about them. You know, they're simple, they're very common. Another good thing about them is that you can add your layers, you can put in your near misses, your unsafe behaviours. And a real key point is because they're so common in many workplaces, rather than have fights about taking them out, perhaps we can look at how we might use and work them. But if we think about some of the things that's not so good about them, because lots of people today do have a real criticism of them, one of the key things, of course, that's not so good is when they were developed, this is what the workplace looked like. So if you've got thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people doing broadly similar tasks with similar hazard profile, it wouldn't take you very many months or years to have a huge amount of information, which meant you've got a statistically relevant data set. But if your workplace looks like this, where you've got relatively few people, perhaps multitasking, so that the hazard profile is really confusing, you might take 200 or 300 years to get the same statistical set. Well, that's no good, is it? If you're managing safety in the here and now, you haven't got 200 or 300 years to wait. So that could be a real problem on statistical relevance. So I guess if we think about if they're not statistically relevant, can they actually tell us anything? Well, perhaps one of the things they can tell us is merely by the shape. So if I looked at a triangle that I developed in my site or my business and it was this shape, that's telling me probably more about the culture and a lack of trust than it is the actual injuries. Because what I'd be seeing here is the only things that are getting reported are things that can't be hidden. So that would be telling me a little bit more about the culture than it would necessarily about the hazard profile. Another question about they're relevant today is related to high hazard activities. Because in most businesses now, if we look at the high hazard activities, the fatalities are solely related to known existing high hazards rather than the general output of a triangle. So if we think about we've got our fatalities, quite a lot of our life-changing events, but nothing else, it challenges whether that's really exists. And a lot of people also talk about scorecard pressure being a killer of safety culture, and I've certainly seen examples of that as well. The question it throws up is, does being a correct observer of failure automatically make you part of the solution? Well, clearly not. You know, the object of the exercise isn't just to win technical arguments. So I'm going to talk through now some more experience from my working life to think about how we might reflect on where triangles can fit and where they don't fit. We're working at the base of the triangle. So take you through one of my experiences. I turn up first time at a new site. I'm a clever lad, I can work out from the information barely given that this must be the visitors' car park. So I park up and get my PP on, go and sign the book and go for a walkabout. And what I discover when I go for a walk is that the pathway is very poorly marked. There's equipment stored across the pathway, and it forces people that they have to stray from the safe path into the path of vehicles and actually into quite some places of danger. So they have to perform some unsafe behaviours, base of the triangle stuff. The pathway was also poorly maintained, and there were a few trip hazards in there, but again, very much base of the triangle. And actually when I got into the middle of the site, what I discovered was the visitors' car park sign damage wasn't actually an errant van driver who didn't know his way around and know better, that across this site, sign damage appeared to be a bit of a sport. So that was telling me a little bit about the culture of the place, of what was acceptable, what was tolerated, where the whole relationship between the workforce, the supervisors, the management and the goals and beliefs of the business were. But all base of the triangle stuff. And as I went further round, I saw lots of housekeeping issues. And you consider that at the time, this business had a zero waste to landfill policy, probably the most deplorably stacked skip you could hope to find. So that gave me a bit of a clue that actual posters, slogans, mantras, and the day-to-day activity of this business were totally disconnected. But base of the triangle stuff. As I went further round, interesting observation, somebody every day needs to go and take a reading or check the dial underneath that flap on top of the tank. To do so, they can't reach, so they stack a couple of pallets up. Now in the background, what you can see is tens of thousands of beautifully manicured concrete blocks, because that's what they made. But they didn't use any blocks to make a proper step, they used the pallets, and over time the pallets wear and rot a little bit, but again, still base of the triangle stuff. Further around the site, you see the broken ladder. Now the purist might say, well, the base of the ladder's fine, and it is. If you stand on the bottom rung of that ladder, the relationship of your weight and the ground will be bottom left, bottom right, fairly stable. Get onto the middle rung, however, and the relationship changes to bottom left, top right, and you don't have to move yourself very far before your centre of gravity throws you off. So a little bit further up the triangle, perhaps. And then into one of the production areas, and here's one of the guys doing what he needs to do to keep the process running. Bear in mind, I'm head of safety, first day on site, walking around with a camera. This is normal how they do stuff around here. This was part of the operation. But if he steps back and falls there, that framework on the other side is going to either hit him somewhere between the base of the back and the top of his head. So there isn't a comfortable way that he's going to be able to fall off there. But at the moment, this is unsafe behaviour, base of the triangle. How far is it off standing on the bucket to get a bit higher on the step ladder, or standing on the outside of the mute to get a bit higher up to the framework? But all base of the triangle stuff around working at height. If we look at hazardous energy, so this panel can be turned off but not locked off. This emergency stop isn't an emergency stop, this is an extreme emergency stop. And when I asked the people at the site what's the difference between an emergency and an extreme emergency, nobody could tell me. But I was getting a very consistent message that turning the equipment off was going to be a bad idea. This was not going to be popular. On the same site, they actually like power that much that they still plugged into things that had been rejected by their testing system. This does have lockable isolation, but because the screws are missing on the back, you could actually rotate it round, which would then re-energise. And this panel looks like it's locked, but on closer evaluation, the lock is actually through the handle and not through the locking point. So even though it looks like there might be a lock on it, it might as well not be, because it can be opened up and you can be exposed to the to the dangerous parts of the moving machinery. On this interlock here, the metal component has been disconnected from the lid, so when the lid lifts up, the interlock still reads closed, so it leaves it energised. And on this one, it's a bit hard to see, but if you look carefully, what you can see there are plastic tie wraps around the plunger of the interlock, so it's reading that the gate is closed when the gate is very obviously open. So some of those pictures were from my good friend Phil Chambers and some from Rob Shaw. But base of the triangle stuff. So if we think about a proportion of our unsafe behaviours are by people undertaking high hazard activities, and we have a few of our near misses, my joining the dots tells me here that just because there's nothing in the middle, that actually doesn't mean that the top and the bottom aren't related and can't be a subset of the whole triangle. And this becomes quite important for me when I'm visiting a site and working with a company, because if they do have a good use of triangles, I wouldn't be inclined to argue with them about using them, but I would perhaps focus them a bit more on how do we work on the high hazard activities. And here's why. Because in my 38 years, I'm yet to see a workplace that displayed high hazards regarding their high hazard activity, high standards regarding their high hazard activities, whilst at the same time tolerating low standards with everything else. So joining the dots on this one, if you join a business that's using triangles and appear to be valuing them and getting something out of them, it might be better to show them how they can tangibly help them work to reasonable effect, rather than win an argument as to why they shouldn't work.